He crossed the parking lot with the kind of speed that had been practiced for years. Elbow tucked, briefcase tight, eyes fixed on the revolving door. His shoes made the precise, confident sound of leather on concrete. Around him, people moved in schedules tucked into their sleeves, appointments, errands, a lunch break measured in minutes. Above that river of movement, the mall hummed like a machine. Air conditioning sighs, music piped in to sell a particular kind of calm, the distant clack of heels on marble. She walked the opposite way, bare feet on warm pavement. A small backpack with one strap, faded and frayed. Hair tied back with a scrap of cloth. Her face held the blunt honesty of a child who had not learned how to soften herself for polite company. She stopped in the shadow of his shadow and looked up at him as if the world were simply one more thing she might ask permission to touch. "Sir," she said, clear and small, with no hesitation. "May I sing here?" The question landed like a coin on tile, brief, certain, impossible to ignore. Around them, the flow of the crowd kept moving for a breath, then splintered. People glanced sideways, some with annoyance, some with curiosity, most with that private script in their heads that decided whether a moment deserved attention. Ricardo almost answered the automatic way of his life, polite deflection, a smile that kept people at a distance. He could have mouthed no, could have stepped into the door, could have let mall security make quick work of a small discomfort. He had meetings in 40 minutes and an inbox that solved itself only if he blinked fast enough. Instead, he paused. It surprised him. Later, he would try to find the exact mechanism. Was it the way she spoke without pleading, the steadiness in her voice, the look that did not ask for pity? Maybe it was something older, the memory of a front stoop long ago. A small song hummed between two people who had less than they needed, but more courage than they thought. Whatever it was, the pause became choice. "Inside?" he asked, because the question required a place. It was a small permission. It was not an invitation to stay. "Yes." She stepped forward anyway, as if permission had been assumed all along. Behind her, an older woman watched from the bench beyond the planter. She wrapped a shawl around her knees like armor. Her hair was all silver at the temples, and there was something watchful in the way she managed the child's world. An economy of gestures that said she had done the math of survival and had become expert in what to protect. Dona Noza moved with the slow certainty of someone who had been carrying responsibility a long time. She kept her hands folded on the bag that held whatever they owned. When she spoke, her voice was low and careful. "She sings," she said, explaining nothing, as if that explained everything. The mall music shifted to a default piano loop. Shoppers did the thing people do in such places. They softened their faces into small smiles and quick private judgments. A family paused near the fountain. A teenager with bright nails raised a phone, curiosity propped for an image. The security guard glanced over, frowning, half ready to reclaim the public space from whatever discomfort this young voice might create. Helena found an empty tile, squared her shoulders like a tiny soldier, and began. Her voice had no pretense. It was a plain thing, neither trained nor intentionally theatrical. She sang a little melody that went like this. Short lines, a thread of tune that fit an open palm. It spoke of the sun touching windows, of bread at mornings, of a small light that stayed even in the dark. The words were simple, images a child might keep when the world refuses to carve them in stone. The warmth of a soup bowl, the hush of a church bench, the promise of a footstep coming home. It was small and exact. And then, piece by piece, the mall did what the mall rarely did. It quieted. Conversational bubbles popped. Phones were lowered. People who had been moving continued to move, but they did so without the urgency that had colored everything minutes before. The song cut through the artificial soundtrack and left a real sound in its place. Soft, honest. A voice not designed to sell anything, only to be heard. Ricardo felt it like a hand on the back of his neck, a soft pressure that made him turn. He watched, at first with that executive's distance he had mastered, observing pattern, reading behavior, but a line in the song found him and held. It did not tug at guilt. It slipped around the hardened places and found a smaller, more human part that did not live in his calendar. Around them, faces altered. A woman put a hand over her mouth. A man with a briefcase slowed his step and bent as if to catch the ending of a sentence. The security guard had his palm on his radio, but his jaw softened. The teenager lifted the phone, then lowered it, deciding not to record but to simply watch. A toddler clapped on instinct. His mother smiled with a new wetness in her eyes. Helena finished the verse and held the final note. There was no chorus, no dramatic finish. She just let the sound rest and looked up, measuring the space of reception like a person testing a bridge for weight. Silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It had color now, the afterglow of attention. Someone in the crowd laughed softly, embarrassed by how close they'd come to feeling something. Someone else clapped, tentative and real. A few coins in the fountain chimed as if in agreement. Ricardo, who had planned to be at another place in 20 minutes, felt for the first time in a long while that time was fluid. He lingered where he stood. The briefcase seemed to add a needless weight. "You have a beautiful voice," he said, the words surprisingly plain in his mouth. Helena's face registered something like pleasure, then assessment, the flicker that shows a survivor deciding whether kindness is currency worth accepting. "We sing a little," she said. "At church, sometimes by the station. I sing for Dona Noisa." There was no begging in the fact. She stated it as if it were a fact of life. The exchange made space to breathe. "Are you hungry?" he asked, feeling suddenly aware of his own stomach, as if it had been an unanswered question in his life. It was a clumsy follow-up, practical and immediate. He could have walked out and left the rest to the mechanisms of civic life, a donation tin, a charity, a city shelter. He could have done the polite thing, the thing that felt like kindness because it required no change. "I always am," Helena said, but she said it with a smirk, as if hunger were a condition she knew well and not an admission. He bought food because that was the thing a man who knew how to buy things did easily. He walked into the food court and came back with 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil and a small cup of fruit. The smell of citrus and grilled bread filled the small space between them, and for a moment, belonged to everyone. He handed the foil packets to Dona Nusa with a slight bowing of the head. She accepted like a queen accepting a guest's gift, with dignity intact. "You mustn't let her sit by the entrance alone," he said more to himself than to anyone. The sentence was a hands-on fumbling attempt to do more than buy food. "We live 2 blocks down," Dona Nusa said. "There's a room. It's warm enough. We manage." Her accent held the soft edge of a life that had carried hard weather. "How old are you?" Ricardo asked Helena, because once you ask a child's age, you admit a certain adult responsibility. She did not answer with a number. She said instead, "I'm small enough to fit on 1 lap." It was a circle of humor and truth that made him smile despite himself. The security guard approached at that moment, not with hostility, but with the flatness of his position. "Ma'am, we have rules about performances." He addressed the older woman because protocol required addressing adults, and because Helena looked precocious but not threatening. "She asked permission," Ricardo cut in, almost before he'd intended to. He felt the authority of his voice in the open space, and surprise at how easily it could scatter the guard's resolve. "Don't make trouble," Dona Nusa said to Helena, and it came out like a command and a plea at once. They ate on the bench. Donovan observed them like a careful anthropologist of the everyday. How they navigated the receiving of food. How Helena offered a piece to the old woman in a sort of domestic choreography, apparent yet tender. Ricardo watched the smallest things. The careful way Dona Nusa cut the sandwich into pieces. The way Helena chewed and watched the foot traffic like someone keeping an eye on weather. A man in a tailored suit, a colleague of Ricardo's, happened to be passing. Marcelo. He recognized Ricardo immediately and called out across the plaza. Marcelo was the sort of person who had made a career of working quickly through problems on conference calls. His skepticism was practiced and convenient. He grinned as he approached, the grin of someone accustomed to having his assumptions intact. "Ricardo, fancy seeing you here. Business or pleasure?" Marcelo's eyes flicked to the bench and landed on Helena. The grin tightened. Ricardo introduced them lightly. "This is Helena, and this is Dona Nusa." Marcelo's smile thinned. He had the practical reflex of people who see issues as projects to be contained. "We should move them along," he said with the authority of someone used to clearing variables. "This is a commercial property. They can't just start. We can't have people interfering with the customer experience." The appeal of order, of things that run smoothly, was a force Marcelo worshipped. He saw a problem, and his mind raced toward procedures, calls to authorities, to security. He recommended tidy solutions as if life could be Tetris pieces. Helena met his gaze with the unblinking clarity of the small who have known harshness and measure reactions without melodrama. "I'm not bothering anyone," she said. "I only sang. People listened." Marcelo's jaw shifted. He did not want emotion in his professional zone. He wanted predictability. He was used to arguments that could be solved in meetings, not with eyes and small voices. "You can't just," he began, then stopped because the words were not the right shape to cover what he felt. Unease at being moved, which made him susceptible to resisting. Instead, he adjusted his posture, the practical armor of the managerial class. "We can call the authorities, make sure they are safe." Ricardo felt that uncomfortable tug between systems and humans. It was a tension he was familiar with, policy versus person, efficiency versus mess. He looked at Danny, his calendar humming at him inside his phone, then at the two people beside him, and felt a prick of irritation at himself. Why did he feel the tendency to walk away with a justifiably neat conscience? Why did the sight of the older woman's hands, strong as they were, make him think of the hands he had used in boardrooms to sign off on decisions that changed other people's days? He swallowed and made a small decision that surprised even him. "Are you two staying in the area today?" he asked. "We have the room," Dona Neusa said. "But sometimes—" She did not finish, because saying sometimes invited an inventory of small defeats. "Tomorrow," Ricardo said before he realized he had committed. He squeezed the last bite of fruit, made himself neat. "Tomorrow I'll bring something, a blanket maybe, and some warm food." Helena looked at him like she had measured the width of the world and found it contained. She did not ask. She seemed accustomed to promises that came and went like weather. But her eyes were a ledger, and she recorded the name on the ledger carefully. "Okay," she said. Marcelo made the face of someone who had seen charity before and judged it an operational risk. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice so the mood at the bench would not be disturbed more than it already had been. "You can't get personally involved. People expect boundaries. If you start bringing blankets and jobs and rooms, that becomes a corporate liability. You know how the board thinks." Ricardo heard the practical argument as if it were a statement drawn in black ink. Neat, professional. He also heard the human pulse behind it. Fear thinly disguised as worry about reputation. Marcelo's world was organized into systems and worst-case scenarios. His reflex was to cool the heat of an unscheduled kindness with a shower of protocol. "Not jobs," he almost said at first, because the idea of offering immediate employment to a grandmother at that moment was absurdly impulsive. But the thought arrived anyway, shaped like an idea that could not be contained by immediate practicality. "Not jobs," he corrected silently, "but something practical, something that doesn't end with a story and a photo." He wanted to say more. "I will not let this be a single headline. I will not let this be one sandwich and then the street again." He wanted to say that a promise, even an awkward one, was better than a smooth conscience. He kept his mouth to the more acceptable edges and promised a blanket and food for the next day. Marcelo gave him a look that meant, "Be careful." He pressed his lips. "Just be careful with expectations. You know how these things play into PR." Ricardo listened, felt the tug of his social orbit. He could feel the calendar demanding attention. He could feel the board's expected behaviors. He also felt something else, an invitation to stay messy for a little while, to let an unresolved human thing exist in his life without the neatness he usually applied. After lunch, he walked back to his car slower than he had come. The briefcase felt less natural, more an afterthought to a pulse that had been awakened. Helena and Dona Nusa walked away together, taking small, efficient steps that had been trained by necessity. They were ordinary in ways that mattered, one carrying a pack that smelled faintly of cloth and incense, the other carrying a small care in her posture. Ricardo tucked the sandwich wrapper into a side pocket of his briefcase and composed himself. He checked his phone, emails, appointments, but the screen felt like a distraction rather than a guide. He dialed a number he rarely called except for emergencies. Silvana, the head of HR at his company, someone who could, if needed, convert impulse into procedure without performing charity. "Silvana," he said when she answered, and kept his voice level. "I need to talk to you about something that might look odd. I met a little girl at the mall just now. She sang. I promised to bring some things tomorrow. I don't want PR. I want something practical. Can we talk?" Silvana's voice was all business and warmth, an efficient heart. "Ricardo, are you sure? We've got compliance, security protocols." "I don't want a press release," he repeated. "I want a plan." She paused, the silence of someone who measured words before committing. "Bring the details," she said. "Tomorrow. We'll meet. If you want to help, we'll do it properly. Food bank contacts, temporary housing options, social workers. We can also look at whether Dona Noisa would be interested in part-time work at the company cafeteria. We have positions used to flex hours, but we'll do it the right way. You won't make it into a headline? He asked. The way he said it revealed more than he intended. He was not asking about publicity, but about dignity. No headlines, Silvana promised, the sound of someone who had learned how to promise practical discretion. If this is important to you, we'll handle it quietly. He agreed. He did not know exactly what quiet would mean in a company that liked to announce every philanthropic move with glossy photos, but the word quiet felt like a vow he wanted to make and be bound by, for reasons he did not entirely understand. He left the mall not feeling cleansed or absolved. He felt the faint pressure of a new obligation, like the edge of a habit forming. It was an odd sensation, a decision that was less about the company and more about him rearranging the furniture of his life so that room could be made for other people. That night, the office was a machine of light and glass. He looked at the plans on his desk and felt the tug of familiarity. He could have folded the mall moment into a private memory and labeled it a kindness done. Instead, he found himself opening a folder and writing a short list. Blanket, food, shoes, a meeting with Silvana at 9 in the morning. Under long term, he hesitated and wrote, consider employment for Dona Noisa, discuss schooling for Helena. Promises have a strange geometry. On paper they look tidy and ethical. In life they require energy and steps, and sometimes disappointment. He knew that better than most. He also knew that breaking a promise was easy. Keeping one took the slow, ordinary work of follow-through. If he was honest, it was the promise-keeping that had always separated him from the myths he told himself about being a good person. He slept oddly that night, his mind looping through the song's soft notes. In a moment between sleep and waking, he pictured the mall quietly full of people who had been touched by a voice and did nothing further, an image that tightened at his throat. He rose with the sense that he had to do something that would be more than one sandwich and an exchange of smiles. Morning was a cold clarity. He found himself in his car again, driving not toward the office, but toward the 2 blocks where Helena and Dona Noisa said they had a room. He told himself he would be discreet, that he would not parade their lives in front of his colleagues, but there was also that inescapable human craving to see whether small acts mattered. He found the building, a tired, flecked brick place whose windows looked out on a narrow street with potted plants and laundry. The room was modest as described. One small window, a bed, a stove, the signs of a life that had been pulled tight around necessity. When he knocked, Dona Noisa opened the door and regarded him with the careful skepticism of someone who had been disappointed by promises before. "You came," Helena said, appearing from the single bed like someone who had been waiting with a map of possible outcomes. "Yes," Ricardo said. "I promised." Dona Noisa let him in with the kind of dignity that does not thank but acknowledges. He set the blanket in a corner, laid out a bag of groceries and a pair of shoes for Helena, small, sensible sneakers that fit like a made promise. He asked questions, gently, about the elders' health, about routine, about whether they had access to social services. He listened when they spoke of the days they had lived with resilience and the quiet resourcefulness they had learned to survive. Helena showed him a small thing, a scrap of paper on which she had copied the song's first line, a child's handwriting that leaned forward as if to get to the next word. "I practice," she said. "I like people to hear." Ricardo found that he liked hearing her practice. He liked the way the small room seemed to expand when genuine care entered. He also felt, in the quiet minutes of conversation, the edges of risk. Commitment requires more than heart. It requires systems and patience and people like Silvana, who know how to set those systems in motion. On his way back to the office, he called Marcelo and told him where he had been. Marcelo listened with the crisp skepticism of someone who believed in boundaries. "Look," Marcelo said finally, "I get it. It tugs at you. But you're not a social worker. Be careful about the precedent. If you start connecting personal cases to corporate resources, we'll have to build policies, disclose things." "It's messy." "It's already messy," Ricardo replied. He did not know why he felt the need to justify himself to Marcelo. Maybe because for years people had measured him by the clarity of his decisions and found them efficient. Maybe because he was learning that clarity can sometimes be a mask for blindness. "Promise me one thing," Marcelo said, more as a coach than a critic. "Keep it private, and keep it sustainable. Don't be a headline." "I will," Ricardo said. He felt it then not as a performative vow, but as a small moral stitch. He did not yet know what the pattern would look like when it emerged, but the stitch had been made. That afternoon, with the corporate day humming around him, he sought practical paths. He sat in a conference room with Silvana, and they sketched a map. Short-term aid, a referral to local housing services, an inquiry into flexible work in the company cafeteria for someone who could manage mornings and afternoons. They spoke about barriers, medical paperwork, enrollment for school, the difficulty of finding a place that would take someone on short notice. "We can set up a paid trial for Donna Nosa," Silvana suggested, her voice steady and competent. "A staff allowance for transition. If the grandmother is interested and able to work part-time, we can formalize it. For Helena, we can approach the local school social worker and find a way to register her. It won't be instant, but it's practical." Ricardo felt an odd relief. The idea that change needed structure did not make it less meaningful. It made it survivable. "We'll keep it quiet," Silvana said again, because privacy was part of dignity. "No press. We'll work through HR, the local charities we partner with. If this becomes an ongoing relationship, we'll design it respectfully. We'll make sure Donna Nusa is paid and has days off. We'll offer childcare support if needed." He found himself nodding, mapping the steps. The company could be a scaffold. It could also be a bureaucratic stone. The difference lay in how they used it. He thought of the mall's quiet, of Helena's song and the way it had held people. He did not believe a single act was magic. He believed a single act could be a crack that let light in, but only if people were willing to widen the opening. That night, as he prepared to leave the office, he received a message from Helena. It was short and surprising, the kind of honesty children afford adults. "Thank you. I hope you like the shoes." It was an image and a small transaction, gratitude given without expectation. Ricardo stood for a long minute in the empty lobby, reflecting. He had entered a space that was not his usual territory. He had been moved, made a promise, and met resistance from the comfortable systems around him. The path forward would require more than a single visit. It would demand time, resources, and the willingness to let parts of his controlled life become less controlled. He thought of the song again. A simple voice had interrupted the smooth flow of commerce and reminded him of a human rhythm he had been neglecting. That interruption had the power to shift him, but only if he answered it with steps that extended beyond sentiment. He left the office with an appointment set for the next morning with Silvana, a list of items to get for Helena and Donna Nusa, and a promise lodged in a place that felt more like a hinge than a burden. On the drive home, he rehearsed polite phrasing for the board if it came to that. He also rehearsed things he did not practice at the office, listening without agenda, showing up without quick solutions. Somewhere between his plans and the beginning of change, there was a practical reality waiting. When good intentions meet systems, friction appears. People who wanted to do the right thing often misstepped when they tried to translate feeling into action without partners who knew how to build durable support. He felt that now as responsibility more than risk. When he reached his neighborhood, he parked and sat with the engine off. It was late, the city lights softened by evening, and in his pocket, his phone held the song's first line that Helena had scribbled. He read it quietly and wondered how small, repeated acts, like coming back tomorrow, like keeping a promise, might change not only a child's day but the angle of his own life. There was a choice in front of him, clear as glass and heavy as a stone, to let the moment pass into memory or to follow it into the slow, less glamorous work of keeping promises. He had begun to understand that the latter required patience and sometimes accountability partners who understood systems. Silvana would be one. Marcelo would be the voice that checked him. But the deeper change, how his company thought about the people who came to its doors and whose small voices sometimes cut through the hum, would need more than a memo. He locked the car and walked toward his apartment. On the sidewalk, an elderly neighbor watering plants paused and smiled as he passed. He returned the smile with something different now, a willingness to be mildly inconvenienced for something that mattered. The inconvenience looked small from the outside, but felt like a new muscle inside him. That evening, as he laid out the blanket he had bought, simple, utilitarian, he thought of the line in Helena's song about a light that stays. He realized he did not know yet how exactly he would keep the promise to widen that light. He only knew the obligation of being moved had lodged into his life and would not be fished out by excuses. Outside, the city exhaled. Inside, he drafted an email to Silvana with bullet points, practical next steps, meeting with local shelter services, contact for temporary linens, inquiry about cafeteria staffing hours. He added one line at the end, an instruction to himself as much as an administrative note. Keep it quiet, keep it dignified, keep it real. Somewhere 2 blocks away, Helena slept under the blanket he had brought that morning. She dreamed, maybe, of songs and of slightly warmer mornings. Dona Noisa sat in a chair near the window, a thermos at her feet, the outline of the day mapped in small motions she had learned to carry. Neither of them had asked for promises in the currency he had offered. They had instead given him a chance to be better, to shift a life that had assumed he could remain unchanged. Ricardo did not yet know what full change would look like. He had made the beginning moves: the food, the shoes, the promise, the meeting with HR. He had also drawn lines in his calendar that would force him to show up. The long road ahead was not yet paved. But for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt the hum of his days sink to something other than profit and efficiency. He felt open to being revised. The city turned, commerce continued, and the memory of a barefoot girl's voice hung in the air like a bell you could not quite ignore. He slept that night not with certainty of outcomes, but with the strange, steady comfort of someone who had decided, finally, to keep a promise. The next morning, Ricardo arrived at the small building with a different kind of hurry, one that moved slowly. He walked the stairwell instead of taking the elevator, letting the light from the street windows wash over him in a way that felt less like a commute and more like a reconnaissance. He had a list that read like a map: meet Silvana, check housing options, secure the trial job, make sure Helena could be enrolled in school. The list did not feel like a schedule to beat. It felt like a set of promises to be kept. Silvana met him in the HR office with a thermos of coffee and a stack of contacts she had already pulled together. Her competence made the practical tasks look simpler than they were, until she named the obstacles. Identification papers might be missing. A school enrollment needed documentation and time. Health checks, vaccinations, a payroll setup that would not humiliate anyone. "We'll need consent forms," she said. "We'll need someone to walk with them through the offices. We can't treat them like a case number." "I don't want them to be a case," Ricardo said. "They're people." Silvana nodded. "Then we do it the right way. We protect dignity. We make it normal work with normal pay. We don't advertise it." She tapped a spreadsheet. "I can authorize a paid trial for Dona Noisa in the cafeteria. We can offer transportation for interviews. If Helena is old enough for school enrollment, we work with the district social worker for an expedited intake." They called, emailed, and arranged. A social worker met them at the neighborhood building the next day and listened, at length and without hurry, while Dona Noisa explained her story in measured sentences. She spoke of a husband long gone, of small jobs that never lasted more than a season, of ways she had kept Helena fed and warm. She spoke not to be pitied, but as if she were giving inventory. "This is what we have. This is what we can do." The social worker translated the inventory into a plan. There were forms that required signatures and stamps. There were waiting lists that needed to be navigated. There were a dozen small indignities that could easily accumulate until dignity cracked. Questions about a birth certificate that an older adult had never been asked to find. A school district clerk who needed proof of address. Each task was a small test of resolve. Each time someone at the company or in the social services office treated them like ordinary people trying to arrange ordinary things, Helena's and Dona Nusa's faces relaxed a little. Ricardo learned quickly that goodwill needed partners. Silvana became the partner who could move systems. The social worker was the partner who could convert paperwork into access. A small group of colleagues volunteered discreetly. One friend in legal offered to help with identification issues. A manager in facilities arranged a smaller spare room the company rented for visiting contractors that could serve as temporary lodging until a longer-term solution was found. When the trial job in the cafeteria was proposed, Dona Nusa considered it carefully. She cooked, yes, but not for corporate cafeterias. Her experience had been with small neighborhood kitchens where recipes arrived by memory and seasoning by intuition. Would an industrial kitchen flatten the tenderness out of her food into standardized trays? Would she be paid fairly? Would her schedule allow for the child's school runs? She asked questions that were precise, the kind of questions someone who had managed scarcity for years asks because consequences mattered. "Will I be paid for training?" she asked. "How many hours a week? Will there be a contract? Will Helena have safe pickup at school? I cannot leave her wherever." Silvana answered with spokes of certainty. "We'll start with a paid trial of 15 hours a week. You'll be on payroll. We'll provide transportation vouchers for any school-related needs and a contact person if you need flexibility. It's not charity. It's employment." The language mattered. It steadied Dona Nusa. She accepted the trial, not out of need alone, but because the terms respected her agency. She signed the forms knowing this was work she could do, not a favor she had to endure. Meanwhile, Ricardo kept stepping into the minor, human obligations he had promised. He bought school supplies that were ordinary and unglamorous. A backpack with sturdy straps, a set of notebooks, pencils sharpened and boxed. He took Helena to the registration office, where she sat like anybody else, small hands folded, eyes curious. She answered the registrar's questions with clear, simple sentences. Her name, where she lived, the song she liked to sing. The registrar asked where she learned to sing. Helena said, "At church and on the street and with Dona Nusa." The phrase landed and then passed like a dove. Helena began school on a wet morning. She walked into a classroom where the teacher, a woman with soft hair and a name tag that read, Marta, greeted her with a smile that said, "I've been ready for someone like you." Marta put Helena at a desk near the window and gave her a small stack of picture books. In a week, Helena could read a few words aloud, shy at first. Then with the same courage she used to step into a mall and ask to sing. At the cafeteria, Dona Nusa arrived for the paid trial and found herself surrounded by stainless steel and orders printed on slips. The first morning she moved like a curious traveler in a new place. She washed her hands with a thoroughness born of discipline, tied an apron that smelled of bleach and spice, and set to work. Her hands, which had always known how to feed, found an economy that allowed small improvisations. A pinch more garlic here, a dollop of fresh spice there, a tenderness in the soup that the workers noticed without naming it. The first day a line formed for lunch, a bank of employees who rushed official tasks through and were used to corporate food that tasted efficient. When they tasted Dona Nusa's stew, they did pause. It was nothing dramatic, just a different shade of flavor, and that was enough. People began to ask where the aroma came from. They began to come a little earlier to the lunchtime window, not because their calendars said so, but because they liked what filled their mouths. At first, Marcelo watched these small changes with the professional suspicion of someone keyed to outcomes. He had not expected cooking to become a lever for anything beyond a satisfied palate. He kept one eye on the payroll spreadsheets and another on the rumor mill. He was careful with praise, the way some men are careful not to soften in public. But gradually, a pair of colleagues began to remark that the cafeteria had started to feel like a place where people lingered. They brought friends. They stopped tackling emails while eating. They told stories to each other. Ricardo noticed this too, not because he wanted to measure a return on kindness, but because he was curious how small shifts ripple. He sat one afternoon at the cafeteria table and watched a woman in marketing recommend Dona Nusa's chickpea stew to two interns who looked like they had never tasted something so slow-cooked. He watched colleagues of different ranks and different life stories line up together and talk. For the first time in months, he observed that morale could spring from quiet, shared things, a good meal, a minute of laughter, a pause between a bite and a sentence. The practical work of staying involved continued. The company paid for a small furnished room nearby for a short-term rental, while longer housing arrangements were found. The room was modest, clean sheets, a kettle, a single lamp, but it offered a threshold the street did not. Ricardo arranged to pay the first 2 months' rent, which, in his ledger, was a small line item, but in Helena's and Dona Nusa's lives meant fewer nights of worry about where to shelter. They kept the arrangement quiet. There were no press photos, no official announcements. A few colleagues knew because they had to. Silvana, the social worker, the facilities manager who helped move boxes. The value of privacy became an active part of the help. It was a way of saying that dignity is not a public spectacle. Time, always the blunt instrument, did its usual work. Paperwork was completed. School assignments were returned with small stars. Dona Nusa learned a new routine, the clocking in beep, the bus route timing, the lunch menu planning. She arrived early and stayed late on her first weeks, not because she wanted to impress, but because she wanted to be good at the job. Skill grew in the shoulders, in the movements that made kitchen life efficient. She measured ingredients with a care that honored both the recipe and the people who would eat it. Helena adapted to the rhythms of school. She fell in love with a teacher who read aloud and another who taught her how to hold a pencil properly. She formed a small friendship with a girl named Lila who loved drawing birds. One day Helena drew a picture of a mall fountain with people sitting around it, and Lila asked if the little girl near the fountain was a princess. Helena smiled and said, "Maybe. She sings sometimes." At the company, a quiet ritual took root. On Fridays, a small table in the cafeteria held extra loaves of bread from Dona Nusa's tray for employees to buy by donation. The funds collected went back to the household for incidentals: shoes, school supplies, medical co-pays. Ricardo never called it charity when asked. He called it participation. It was a small collective act of reciprocity that meant people were engaged rather than merely observing. Not all reactions were positive. There were emails in the corporate inbox from anonymous addresses complaining about special treatment. At a board meeting, a cautious director asked if the small program obeyed policy. Ricardo answered in a way that had not come easily before, with specifics. He offered the payroll sheets, the signed contract, the benefits plan for the part-time worker. He showed that the effort had been structured to prevent exception creep. The board, practical in its anxieties, agreed to a pilot policy for flexible hiring for neighbors and community members. A policy that recognized two truths: companies take resources and can return some to their neighborhoods, and dignity should not be sacrificed for ease. Marcelo, who had been the loudest voice of caution, changed most slowly. He still asked the hard questions at meetings, but the tone shifted. He noticed a change in himself, quiet and embarrassing. He found himself seeking Dona Nosa's soup when he ran late. He found himself telling the valet to give the spare lunch voucher to a colleague who forgot theirs. The friction between his professional caution and his human reaction began to soften as he saw the practicalities of employment. Structured, paid, accountable, replaced the ad hoc, performative interventions he had feared. Helena's voice, which had first stopped a mall crowd, grew in small but visible ways. She sang now in the classroom for show and tell. She sang for a holiday gathering at the neighborhood center. She learned a piano at school and practiced a little, her small fingers tentative and then surer. She had opinions about songs, and she offered them. A short hymn that always made her hum the rest of the day, a silly rhyme about shoes that made the class laugh. Her songs became, for her, a language for both joy and belonging. Months passed. The small room became less temporary. They found a modest apartment with a landlord willing to rent with a short-term contract. The company helped with the down payment for the first month and a security deposit, money that felt less like handout and more like a bridge. The social worker found a program that assisted with medical checkups and helped schedule Helena's vaccinations. A neighbor introduced Dona Nusa to a supplier of fresh herbs who sold in small quantities and gave credit terms for small businesses. The threads of support lengthened, not as a net to catch them, but as scaffolding to stand on while they rebuilt. One autumn afternoon, Ricardo walked into the cafeteria and found a small crowd gathered near the window. A notice had been placed on the board. On Friday, there would be a small event to welcome new employees and community members who had joined in recent months. It would be simple, a buffet prepared by Dona Nosa, a few words from the staff, and, as an honor for the person who had, months before, stopped the mall noise with a voice, a short performance. Helena had asked if she could sing for the company. She had rehearsed a song that had changed slightly from the one she sang in the mall. The melody was the same root, but now the words included lines about bread shared at a table and about a light that waited at a door. She wanted to sing because she wanted to say thank you in the way she knew best. Ricardo, who had become adept at hiding the feeling that rose in him when she sang, sat near the back. He watched people gather, employees who had once been strangers to him, cafeteria staff who had worked shifts together for years, Silvana juggling the event's small logistics. Even Marcelo was there, arms folded in a posture that tried to be neutral but betrayed curiosity. Helena stepped forward with an ease born of practice. There was no spotlight. She had on the same sneakers Ricardo had bought her months ago, now a little scuffed at the toe. She took the microphone like a person who had a thing to offer, not a plea. As she sang, the cafeteria softened. Orders left, paused hands. Conversations died into attentive silence. Her voice had grown. It was cleaner, more confident, threaded with the small earnestness of a child. She sang about mornings, about bowls of soup, about hands that fold like stories, about a light that waits at the door. At the line where she sang of a warm room, Ricardo felt the old administrative edge of his life tilt into something that could be felt rather than measured. He remembered the exact moment in the mall, the tiled floor, the bench, the way the moment had asked something of him, and he realized that the question had been answered in small ways he had almost refused to expect. Forms signed, a payroll processed, shoes that fit, a school bag with the name written clearly on a tag. When Helena finished and the small cafeteria erupted in gentle applause, she bowed in the serious way that children do when they have practiced the ritual of thanks. She walked to the table where people had left small notes and drawings. She found, among the folded papers, a small scrap that Ricardo did not expect. A tiny folded heart of paper with a line inside that read, in a child's hand, "Thank you for staying." She held the note like an offering, and then looked up. Her eyes found Ricardo, and for a moment his world narrowed to her face. He had stopped a lot of things in his life, meetings, phone calls, lunches, to attend to the work that the song began. He felt an odd humility. He had been saved in small ways by a child's decision to sing. After the event, people lingered. Conversations threaded through gratitude and, as always, practical concerns about scheduling and procedures. Someone suggested making the Friday table a regular event. Another suggested training sessions for employees to cook with Dona Nusa, sharing recipes and culture. Silvana proposed a modest community engagement program, 3 paid positions for neighborhood residents each year, a partnership with the local school district for mentorship, and a quiet policy to protect privacy while offering help. These were not sweeping reforms. They were practices. They were small, steady scaffolds that had to be built and maintained. The company board approved a pilot budget for the program. The pilot meant boundaries, forms, and accountability. It also meant regular opportunities for neighbors to access employment with dignity. Marcelo came to find Ricardo one afternoon with a different expression on his face. He had been quiet for weeks about the cafeteria. Now he looked like a man who had been surprised by his own empathy. "I may have been too quick," he said, then laughed in an embarrassed way. "Your cafeteria has better flavor than my grandmother's, I confess." "It's more than flavor," Ricardo said. "It's how people show up for each other." Marcelo nodded. "I guess I'm learning that small things have momentum." He looked away, then back. "Also, my son loved Helena's song. He keeps humming it." Ricardo felt the strange charge of recognition that comes when someone acknowledges change. "That's good," he said. "That's exactly the kind of thing we want, real participation." Outside the company walls, the neighborhood felt steadier. People in the street would nod to Dona Nusa as she walked with a thermal box, or to Helena on the way to school. The landlord who had once only tolerated them now looked at them with a little regard, a human feeling that was not transactional. The little networks that make life possible, shopkeepers, bus drivers, school aides, began to recognize them as part of the town's living fabric. Helena's voice, once a sound that could stop a shopping crowd, became a tune that threaded through other small places. She performed at the school's winter concert, standing beside Marta, her teacher, whose applause was both pride and relief. She sang for a small charity event one Saturday and earned a modest fee that she insisted on putting into a jar for a future piano. She practiced scales on a keyboard, sometimes donated by a colleague in IT who had a spare instrument in his storage. She was learning that music was not just a way to be seen, it could be a way to learn and grow. One evening, months after the first song, she and Dona Nusa came to Ricardo's office with a small parcel wrapped in paper. "We made you something," Helena said, offering the parcel with both hands. Inside was a jar of preserved lemons, with a small tag that read, in careful letters, "For Mr. Ricardo, so your food tastes like home." The gesture was unspectacular and perfect. Ricardo realized that the currency of thanks was not a formal dinner or a plaque. It was a jar someone had made with their own hands. He put the jar on his desk and felt a warmth he could not otherwise explain. He thought of how many people in his life gave him advice rather than jars, plans rather than practice. He liked the jar. The program at the company grew, not because leaders demanded it, but because people started wanting to be part of it. Colleagues volunteered on weekends to help with school projects. The marketing team offered to help design flyers for a small community fair. Silvana built a training package so employees could learn how to mentor without patronizing. The modestness of the pilot meant it had to be defended, and people defended it by showing up and doing the everyday work that makes policies endure, responding to emails, making payroll entries, training new hires. There were friction points, times when systems chafed. An accountant once sent an email asking for documentation for an expense that had been intended for the family's medical copay. A vendor needed a signature for a box of ingredients. Bureaucratic demands required patience and the willingness to translate care into receipts. Silvana and Ricardo learned to treat such moments as administrative problems to be solved kindly, not as moral tests to avoid. The cultural shift was subtle. People who had seen charity as an event began to see it as part of how they wanted to live. Lunch tables became places where stories were exchanged. An employee who had once measured success only in quarterly returns began to bring a thermos of soup to his team when they worked late. a young manager proposed a slow lunch policy 2 afternoons a week, an hour where people were encouraged to step away from screens and eat together. Productivity did not suffer. Instead, morale subtly rose. Helena, who had once been cautious about promises, kept hers too. She started a small notebook where she wrote things she wanted to do. Learn a new song, read a whole book, help Dona Nusa make a new stew. She took school seriously because she had begun to feel the grip of future possibility. She practiced singing for no audience sometimes, humming under her breath as she arranged crayons or swept a small porch. Her voice was now a part of her identity, not merely a tool to open doors. The months accumulated into seasons. Winter came with a small storm that made the city soft and white. The company, following the pilot's success, organized a small donation drive for neighbors, blankets, warm coats, and grocery vouchers. Helena helped pack items, her small hands quick and efficient. She labored not as a spectacle, but as someone participating in a community. When spring arrived, the company approved the next phase, 3 paid positions reserved annually for local residents who might benefit from steady, dignified work. It was not a grand program. It had limitations and rules. It required documentation and oversight. It required continuing modest acts of care, transportation vouchers, schedule flexibility, and a social worker on call. For those who had been skeptical, the program's modesty proved to be its strength. It was sustainable because it respected both the institution and the human beings it aimed to help. A small plaque was commissioned for the cafeteria wall, not a proclamation, but a commemoration. It read simply, "Where a small voice was heard, many voices found a table." It was hung at eye level, not in a place of glory, but a place where people might notice it while queuing. Under it, a photo array featured candid images, hands stirring soup, a child with a pencil, a woman receiving a paycheck. The images were taken with consent, not for publicity, but for memory. One afternoon, as the company prepared for an event celebrating the program's 1-year mark, Helena asked if she could sing again. This time, the space would be the company lobby, a place of passing feet and morning coffee. She wanted to bring a song that had new lines, one about a neighbor who kept a jar of lemons, one about a room with a window that caught morning light, one about a promise that stuck. Ricardo listened to her practice in the small conference room where she and Marta rehearsed. He admired the way her voice now carried confidence without pretense. He thought about the arc of months, the food, the shoes, the forms, the quiet policies. He thought about the way his life had been nudged toward a different center of gravity. He had less appetite for the neatness of his old routines, and more appetite for the messy work of keeping promises. Keeping a promise, he had learned, was not a grand act, but the accumulation of small, ordinary choices. The lobby that morning was not full. People streamed through, some with coffee, some with laptops. A few stopped when they recognized Helena. Some glanced as they passed. She took the floor with a calm, like someone who had practiced waiting for the right moment. She sang not to stop people, but to invite them. The melody threaded through the hum of footsteps and folded into conversations. When she reached the line about a light that stays at the door, a woman carrying a toddler froze, then smiled. A man on a business call lowered his voice. A cleaner pushed a cart and paused, eyes soft. People listened not because they had to, but because they wanted to. After the song, a few hands found hands, small offers of thanks that were not performed for cameras. A woman in facilities, who had once been the first to point out procedural risks, hugged Dona Nusa. Marcelo, who had been standing at the edge, approached Ricardo with a clumsy apology, and then admitted, "I'm glad you pushed." Ricardo responded with a small laugh, the kind that acknowledges both regret and gratitude. Helena handed Ricardo a small paper she had folded. Inside was a drawing, a jar, a song note, and a door with light. On the back she had written, in her careful letters, "For staying." It was a phrase that refused to be simple. It acknowledged that promises are easy to make and hard to keep. It thanked him not for the bread alone, or the rent, or the job, but for the posture of someone who chose to remain involved. Ricardo felt the weight of that thank you, like something that confirmed a shift in him. He had not set out for transformation. He had set out to be decent. But the decency had taught him to become something else, someone who recognized that the world contains work that is not on his calendar, but nevertheless belongs to him. The program kept evolving. The company created a modest fund for neighborhood emergencies. The cafeteria training program began to host small culinary nights where neighborhood recipes were celebrated. A local camera club created a small photo series highlighting the relationships the program had fostered. None of it was extravagant. None of it promised to solve systemic poverty. It made openings where previously there had been walls. Years later, the little mural in the lobby had a fresh coat of paint and a new caption added by someone with a light touch. "We were changed as much as we changed." It hung near the photo of a bench at the mall, an image that, for those who knew the story, signaled the exact point where small attention met responsibility. Helena grew into a teenager whose voice matured and whose choices were more deliberate. She played piano at the neighborhood center sometimes and taught other children a melody she had written about winter light. Donna Noisa became more than a cafeteria cook. She became, in the mouths of employees, a beloved figure whose recipes carried the flavor of belonging. She saved a little each month and once, on a morning when the sun felt generous, surprised the staff by bringing a dozen sweet empanadas to share. Ricardo's life rearranged itself in ways subtle and durable. Meetings still demanded his presence. Deals still required his judgment. But where he had once reserved his emotional energy for the mechanics of business, he now kept a small portion for the people who moved through his life. He attended parent-teacher meetings for Helena on occasion, and once sat in the back of a school assembly listening as she recited a poem about the city. He learned names of neighbors. He learned to accept small gifts, jars, drawings, songs, as the currency of real connection. The one-year event turned into another year, and then another. The company's pilot policy quietly spread into a structured community engagement plan that other departments took as a model. More importantly, the people who worked there began to see that being human at work required policies, yes, but also the willingness to be inconvenienced by one another in humane ways. There were setbacks. The economy tightened one fall, and budget conversations reopened questions about program funding. There were personal disappointments too. An application for a longer-term housing subsidy was denied. A temporary roommate arrangement created friction. But those setbacks were not the end of the story. They were the ordinary hazards of life that the local networks and the program learned to navigate. They did not erase the trust that had been built. On a spring afternoon, years after that first unexpected song, Ricardo walked through the company lobby and stopped before the plaque. He touched the edge with his thumb, like a man acknowledging a seam. He thought of the mall's tiled floor and the way a small voice once startled him into attention. He thought of the long work that had followed, the forms, the meals, the mistakes, the quiet commitments that never asked for a medal. Helena came up beside him, tall now, but still with the same clarity in her face. She was carrying a small notebook, the one she had begun years before, with the list of things she wanted to do. She showed him an entry. Teach a class at school. She had become someone who made plans rather than only received them. She put her hand on his arm, a careful gesture that said, "Thank you without demand." "You kept coming," she said simply. "You didn't stop." Ricardo wanted to answer with a speech, but found the right words were short. "You kept singing," he said. She smiled, the kind of smile that includes memory. "We both did," she said. "You with your papers, me with my songs." They both laughed then, two people who knew they had been changed by small acts. It was not a rescue story. It was a story about mutual rescue, about how a child's decision to be seen led to a man deciding to be accountable, how a woman's willingness to work opened a company's door to neighbors, how colleagues whose days had been measured in timelines found reasons to slow down. As they walked away, Helena hummed a tune that had grown new lines. Ricardo listened and felt the hush that comes when a life rearranges itself around a better rhythm. If there was a single lesson in the long arc, it was this. Moments of attention, when met with sustained responsibility, can change the contour of ordinary lives. The single act, asking to sing in a busy place, was the crack that let light in. But the light did not do the work alone. People did. They kept appointments, paid wages, filled out forms, and gave space. They accepted gifts. They shared meals, and they learned how to listen. They learned that dignity is kept when help is structured, when recipients are treated as partners, and when promises are honored over time. A small plaque, a jar of lemons, a child's song, these were not cures. They were the tokens of a system learning to be humane. If this story reaches you and you feel the small temptation to do something, consider what you can keep, not just give. A promise that can be kept is better than a grand gesture that fades. Think of the neighbor you've ignored. Think of the small thing that would help. An afternoon of your time, an offer of a job that respects schedule, a donation that funds a scholarship rather than a one-off photo op. If this resonated, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that small, sustained acts matter. And if you'd like to do more than share, find a local organization that does dignified work in your community, one that partners with people rather than performing for them, and consider what you can commit to over time. The song was the beginning. The work that followed made the change real. Helena's voice, years later, still carries a clarity that can stop a crowd. When it does, people listen. But now those who listen have learned, in a small company in a city that hums with commerce, to stay and to build the quiet scaffolds that make promises matter.